The Wyoming night roared like a wounded beast as rancher Eli McGraw paced his lonely cabin, his newborn's starving cries slicing through the storm. 3 days had passed since his wife's last breath, and the baby refused every drop he offered. Exhaustion blurred his vision when a soft knock cut through the thunder. Eli opened the door and froze. A young widow stood trembling on the porch, rain-soaked, terrified, and her breasts heavy with milk. In that moment, hope arrived wearing grief of its own. Before we ride deeper into the story, if the spirit of the old frontier still stirs your heart, the campfire tales, the courage, the dust, and the honor, then saddle up with us. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. Eli hesitated only a heartbeat before he wrenched the heavy door wide against the storm, letting cold and a drenched woman stumble into the dim warmth together. And for a suspended moment the world reduced itself to that single, impossible tableau. The stranger at his threshold, the tiny, rasping cry of his newborn in the cradle, and a man who had spent 3 sleepless days walking the thin edge between fury and despair. She looked smaller up close, not the heart, dangerous thing gossip might have painted, but a raw, human figure wrapped in rain and fright. Her dark hair clung to her cheeks like wet rope. Her dress was sodden and clung to the line of her body, and the damp had already begun to darken the fabric at her chest where milk had leaked and left a spreading stain that stole the breath from Eli for reasons he was too stunned to name. Her eyes were hollow with exhaustion but kept a steady thread of purpose, a look that suggested she knew how to count the exact value of a life and had come out into a storm to save one. When the baby's crying at the small room, something ancient in her shifted, an animal memory, a mother's calculus that took no time at all to judge hunger and need and decide which was larger. She did not speak at first. She only moved, quick and sure despite her shivering fingers, and stepped toward the cradle with a gentleness so practiced Eli felt himself step back as if intruding on a sacrament. He should have drawn the rifle strapped above the mantle and measured this stranger with suspicion. He should have demanded answers and proof, asked why she had come alone and what was her name and where were the rider and horse that normally accompany any traveler brave enough to cross this valley in a night like this. But his daughter's tiny body made a plea his words could not match, and his chest loosened where grief had nearly turned to stone. The woman eased the infant into her arms as if she had been waiting a lifetime for such a task. The baby's fists, which had been limp and thin with exhaustion, curled at the touch and then, with a desperate, hungry determination, latched. Eli, who had learned the brutal arithmetic of ranch hands and weather, who could read the health of a foal by the set of its flank, watched with something like disbelief as color returned to the infant's face and the small body that had been betraying him for days began, stubborn as any blackwood, to claim life again. He turned his head away because the sight of the woman's face as she fed his child struck something in him that was both gratitude and shame. Gratitude that any human would have crossed such a storm. Shame because of the secrets he carried and the failures he had buried alongside his wife 3 days gone. When he finally looked again, the woman had tears on her cheeks but her hands were steady. She refused his clumsy offers of a blanket and instead spoke, voice rough from exposure but steady. "My name is Clara Hensley," she said, "and there's no time for questions if you want your baby to live." In that noise of rain and the slow, new suckling sound that filled the cabin like a small miracle, Eli learned 2 things at once: that desperation could move a good man into strange mercy, and that strangers sometimes arrive bearing the very thing a broken home most needs. He closed the door against the wind and the world beyond it, and for the first night since Sarah's body went cold, there was an inside that held warmth, a nursing mother, a man who had nothing left but a desperate promise, and a child who, quite against the math of grief, chose life. Clara's eyes did not leave the baby as she spoke. They were the kind of eyes that measured weight and temperature and need as if she had been doing nothing else her whole life. And when she asked for permission to feed the child, her voice carried neither demand nor hesitation, simply the practical clarity of someone who had decided on a course and would not be turned aside by social niceties. Eli's nod came slow and small, the kind of concession a man gives when all his arguments with fate have been exhausted. In that nod was gratitude so raw it tasted of iron, and shame so old it had its own habits. He stepped back with the awkwardness of a man unused to domestic intimacies, feeling the rifle above the mantel like an accusation against his own weakness, and let himself turn toward the window where rain ran in fingered streams and blurred the world into watercolor. The thunder kept time to the baby's small suckling, a sound that at first was a hope more imagined than real, but which grew steadier with every breath the infant took. Clara moved with a trembling surety, lifting the child close and supporting the tiny head as if she had held 100 such lives in her hands. Her fingers were cold from the night, but her touch was a medicine, and the cramped tongue and weak swallowing that had made Eli's nights unbearable found purchase and rhythm at last. For a long while there was nothing said, only the hush of the room, the slow creak of the chair, the rustle of wet fabric as Clara eased the child, and the steadying intake and release of breath that marks a small life reasserting its claim. Eli felt layers of feeling unpeel inside him, relief that was fierce and immediate, like a belt unbuckled, gratitude that knotted his throat, guilt that crawled at the edges like a chill, reminding him of promises made at a graveside and of the last failing breaths of the woman he had loved. He hated that he could not give the baby what it needed himself, hated that necessity had placed him in the position of pleading to a stranger for the very thing his wife had once given without thought, and the shame burned with a private intensity. When he glanced back, he could not help but see the lines of Clara's face washed by the lamplight, the hollows set by recent loss, and the stubborn steadiness that refused to let grief make her clumsy. Something in her suggested that she had known hunger and fear but had not let them harden her. The baby's fingers found her skin and clung as though to an anchor, and as the minutes stretched, the infant cries slowed into the small sighs of contentment and sleep. Around them, the cabin seemed to lean in, as if the walls themselves were grateful for the quiet. The old kettle on the stove stopped its occasional whistle. The dog, if there had been one, might have ceased its restless pacing, and Eli felt the weight of the storm on the outside lessen marginally in his mind. Clara used the silence to murmur the minimal comforts mothers passed by wrote, a soft word here, a gentle hum there, and the sound turned the room soft. The very cadence of it felt like an old liturgy, a prayer not to gods but to the stubborn will of flesh and blood. When she finally set the baby back in the cradle, moving with the same care she had used to lift her, Eli watched as the child's chest rose evenly and the color in her cheeks was no longer borrowed from fever. Clara wrapped a spare blanket around the newborn, her hands lingering in the small gesture as if checking that warmth had been made permanent. He offered her the only cup he had, and she accepted it like a veteran who knows the courtesy of accepting what is offered. She drank, the whiskey burning but steadying, and then wiped her mouth with the heel of her hand, a small practical motion that seemed to close the moment. For a space of time measured only in the dimming of the lamp, the three of them, man hollowed by recent death, woman hollowed by a different loss, and a child who had nearly been taken by fate, inhabited a fragile peace. Words had not yet found their full shape between them, but an understanding had settled, that tonight they would be companions in survival, that judgment would be postponed while life was mended, and that gratitude and caution could coexist under the same roof. Eli sat back down, feeling both less alone and more exposed, and in the hush that followed the storm outside, he listened to Clara breathe in time with the sleeping baby and wondered at how thin a line stood between ruin and mercy. The fire sank low in the hearth, burning down to the kind of gentle amber glow that made the shadows on the log walls soften, and for the first time in days the cabin held more than desperation. It held stillness, a breath of something fragile and tentative as the baby slept in the cradle with her tiny fists unclenched and her belly full. Eli sat stiffly on the edge of the rough-hewn chair, hands clasped between his knees, every muscle carrying the memory of sleepless nights and grief that felt like it had been packed into his bones with a branding iron. Across from him, wrapped in the blanket he had awkwardly offered, Clara sat near enough to the fire that the rising heat lifted the last sheen of rain from her hair. For a long moment they exchanged no words, the crackling of the embers filling the small space between them, and it was Clara who finally broke the silence with a soft question. "She was your wife?" Spoken so gently Eli almost mistook it for a prayer. He nodded, swallowing hard against the familiar ache that tightened around his chest like a rope pulling taut. "Sarah," he said, and her name seemed to settle in the air, weighted and tender. He told Clara the story in the halting way of a man unaccustomed to sharing sorrow, how Sarah had laughed like spring wind and worked the ranch beside him with more grit than men twice her size. how childbirth had taken its brutal toll on her, how the bleeding had come too fast for him to stop. His voice fractured only once, when he admitted he had promised Sarah the baby would live, no matter what it cost him, and that for 3 days he believed he had broken that promise. Clara listened without interruption, her face unreadable except for the tightening of her mouth at the mention of death's suddenness, and when Eli finished she lowered her gaze to the rim of the cup she held as if reading some truth in the cooling liquid. "My husband was named Jonah," she murmured eventually, fingers curling tighter around the cup. 2 months ago, the mine at Copper Bend collapsed after the foreman pushed men to work deeper than was safe. Jonah was one of the last inside. They dug for 2 days, but they only found his cap. She paused, and Eli saw her swallow hard, the motion small but sharp, like she was forcing broken glass down her throat. "They said it was an accident, called it God's will. But I saw the foreman's face when he told me, saw the guilt he was trying to hide behind the words. They gave me Jonah's wages for the month and told me I was young enough to remarry." Her voice cracked then, so faintly Eli might have missed it if not for the way her fingers trembled. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, crowded with 2 griefs sitting side by side like old neighbors who recognized each other's footsteps even in the dark. But woven through the sorrow was something else, something that hovered between them like the thin warmth of the fire, a gentleness born of shared loss, a recognition that neither of them had asked for this night, yet both had been delivered to it by the same merciless hand of fate. Eli found himself studying Clara in the flickering firelight, the way exhaustion softened her features, the stubborn resolve in the set of her jaw, the quiet tenderness she had shown his daughter without hesitation, and he felt an unfamiliar sensation uncurl inside him, something that wasn't hope yet but might one day grow into it. Clara, sensing his gaze, lifted her eyes, and for a heartbeat they held each other's look not as strangers but as 2 souls standing in the ruins of what life had taken from them. Outside, the storm eased, leaving only the patter of a gentler rain. Inside, the fire gave one last sputter before settling into a steady glow, and Eli realized he hadn't felt this kind of calm since before Sarah fell ill. In the hush that followed, the baby sighed in her sleep, and Clara's eyes softened in response, an instinctive tenderness that made Eli's throat tighten once more. Grief still lay between them like a heavy quilt, but for the first time, something warm threaded through it, a quiet understanding that they were no longer carrying their losses alone. Morning crept into the cabin slowly, thinning the shadows until the world softened into pale gold, and for the first time in nights Eli wasn't woken by the baby's ragged cries but by a silence so foreign he jolted upright, half afraid it meant something terrible. Instead he found Clara asleep in the chair beside the cradle, her chin resting on her chest, her arms wrapped protectively around her middle as though even in sleep she was guarding the tiny life she had saved. Her face in daylight was a different thing, drawn, brittle with exhaustion, the faint bruised hollows beneath her eyes suggesting she hadn't rested properly in days, perhaps weeks, and Eli felt a tug of concern he tried to ignore because concern meant connection, and connection was something he wasn't sure he could afford. He stepped softly, checking the baby first out of instinct, feeling relief loosen his shoulders when he saw her breathing slow and sure, color blooming in her cheeks like a timid sunrise. Clara stirred at the creak of the floorboards, blinking herself awake with a sharp inhale as if her dreams had been deep and unwelcome. She straightened quickly, smoothing her hair and pulling the blanket tighter around herself in the way of someone accustomed to apologizing for taking up space. "You should have taken the bed," Eli said, keeping his voice gentle, but she shook her head immediately, eyes dropping in a habit that spoke of long months navigating around someone else's temper. Only then did he notice the absence. No saddlebags drying by the fire, no bedroll neatly folded in a corner, no boots by the Dora that didn't belong to him. In fact, there was nothing of hers at all except the damp dress now hanging from a peg on the thin shoes drying beneath the stove, even those looked worn near to breaking. More unsettling was the realization that she hadn't written to him. There were no hoof prints outside but his own, no tethered horse waiting beneath the lean-to. Clara hadn't traveled here the way most folks did. She had walked. Through a storm brutal enough to strip bark from trees, she had walked miles of open land in the dark. With a steadying breath he approached the subject carefully, the way a man approaches a skittish mare whose wounds he does not yet understand. Clara, where were you coming from last night?" She froze, the question hanging between them like a knife suspended by a thin thread, and for the first time since she arrived he saw something behind her exhaustion, a flash of fear, quick and sharp as lightning. Her fingers tightened around the blanket, knuckles whitening, and she glanced toward the window as if expecting someone to appear on the horizon. "Nowhere close," she finally murmured, her voice so quiet Eli almost missed it. "I just needed to keep moving." It wasn't an answer, not really, and he knew it. The land out here didn't allow for wandering without reason. "And your horse?" He tried gently. Her jaw tightened. "Didn't have one anymore." The phrasing hit him wrong, anymore. But before he could press, she added, too quickly, "It doesn't matter. I shouldn't trouble you with it. You've enough to bear." She stood as if to busy herself with gathering the baby, but Eli stepped aside, blocking gently, not with force but with intention. "Clara, you came through a storm most folks wouldn't face with a full wagon and 3 hired hands. You came without supplies, without shelter, and you nearly froze doing it. Someone doesn't run like that unless there's something behind them." The air between them tightened like a pole droop. Clara's gaze dropped to the baby, her expression softening in a way that gave her away completely. Protectiveness, fierce, instinctive, absolute. "Please," she whispered, her voice raw. "Don't ask me yet. I can't, not yet." And though the unanswered questions hung heavy as the storm clouds receding over the hills, Eli nodded, because something in her tone told him that whatever she carried was carved deep, the kind of wound that bled slowly and invisibly. The storm outside had passed, but inside the cabin, the weather had only begun to shift. The next 3 days unfolded with a strange, cantive rhythm, a fragile stitching together of necessity and unspoken trust that neither Eli nor Clara dared examine too closely. Mornings began with the baby's soft fussing instead of desperate, gasping cries, and Clara would rise from the chair she'd claimed beside the cradle, her hair tangled from sleep and her eyes shadowed but her movements steady as she lifted the infant with practiced tenderness, settling her against her breast as naturally as if she'd been born for the task. Eli kept himself busy with chores he had neglected during the worst of the storm, chopping firewood, mending the fence where wind had torn branches loose, watering the horses. Yet every time he stepped back inside the cabin, his eyes were drawn to the same sight. Clara bent over the child, humming a soft tune that seemed half lullaby, half prayer, while the baby suckled greedily, growing stronger with each feeding. There was a stubbornness in the child that reminded him painfully of Sarah, and every time her tiny fist curled with new strength, he felt something warm and raw twist in his chest, equal parts relief and grief. Clara, for her part, moved through the cabin with a quiet intentionality that suggested both familiarity and the careful respect of someone who knew she was living in another person's world. She cooked simple meals, thin soups, biscuits stretched as far as flour allowed, and kept the place tidy in small ways that surprised Eli, folding blankets, sweeping dust from corners, tending the fire without being asked. But even as gratitude grew in him like a seed watered daily, something else grew beside it, sharper, harder, awareness. Awareness that Clara startled at sudden noises, her hand flying instinctively to shield the baby. Awareness that she flinched when Eli entered her room too quietly. Awareness that when night fell and the wind picked up, she would glance at the door as though expecting it to burst open at any moment. A woman running from nothing did not behave like that. And though her care for the baby was fierce and sincere, rooted in something deeper than obligation, Eli could not ignore the questions piling up like driftwood against a logjam. Her clothes, now dry, were of good quality but worn thin in places that suggested long travel without proper rest. Her shoes had holes that blistered her feet by evening, and when she thought he wasn't watching, she stretched her shoulders gingerly, wincing as though from older injuries. He found her once standing beside the window with the baby against her chest, staring out across the fields with a look so haunted that it stopped him mid-step, a look that carried fear sharpened into readiness, as if she expected a shadow to detach itself from the tree line and come for her. When he asked gently whether she had slept enough, she gave him a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes and changed the subject. When he offered to saddle her a horse so she could ride to town if she wanted, she refused so quickly her voice cracked. If he pressed too close to the truth, she would draw inward, her words shortening. her breath going shallow until he backed off. Yet in the quiet hours, when the baby slept curled between them on a pallet near the fire, Eli sometimes caught Clara watching him with an expression soft and aching, as though she were memorizing the shape of safety she did not trust to last. And though he told himself it was none of his business, that a stranger's secrets weren't his to demand, he could not shake the certainty that whatever she fled would eventually find its way to his doorstep. Still, when he watched her cradle his daughter with a tenderness so natural it made his throat burn, he knew with a clarity that frightened him that he would face whatever danger she carried before he allowed anyone to take her, or the child, away from this fragile shelter they were building together. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like, and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. Alright then, let's get back on the trail. By the fourth morning, the cabin's stores were thinning to almost nothing. Flour scraped from the bottom of the din. The last of the dried beans simmered into a thin broth, and only a few candles left to push back the long winter dark. And Eli knew he couldn't put off the trip to town any longer, though the thought of leaving Clara and the baby alone pulled at him like a barbed hook. Clara insisted she could manage, but there was a flicker of fear in her eyes she didn't quite mask, and he found himself lingering in the doorway longer than necessary, giving instructions she didn't need, checking the rifle on the mantel twice before finally mounting his horse and riding down the muddy track toward Wallow Bend. The ride felt different now, the air sharper, his senses sharpened with it, every rustle in the grass making him check over his shoulder as if danger stalked somewhere behind him, wearing the shape of Claire's unspoken past. By the time he reached town, the morning sun slanted across the street in pale bands, catching on the dust stirred by wagons and the occasional rider, and for a moment it all looked deceptively ordinary. The blacksmith hammering at his forge, the general store porch crowded with men sipping bitter coffee, the clatter of hooves from the livery barn. Eli tied his horse and stepped inside the mercantile, grabbing what he needed in practiced efficiency: flour, salt, lamp oil, a length of muslin for swaddling. But his mind was elsewhere, tracking the shadows of his own unease. It was on his way back out, goods bundled under one arm, that he heard it. Two ranch hands leaning against the port rail, speaking just loud enough for their words to carry across the boards. "Widows gone missing," one said, dapping ash from his cigarette. Holtz put out notices from here to the state line. Claimed she stole from him and ran off mad as a March hare. Eli froze mid-step, the weight of the supplies suddenly leaden in his arms. The other man snorted. Howled? That old bull. Surprised she didn't run sooner. But stealing? And going crazy on top of it? Man always did like making himself the victim. Maybe, the first replied, but he's offering good coin for her return. Says she took family jewels, cash, even a horse. Says she's dangerous, out of her mind with grief since her husband died. A coldness spread through Eli's gut, slow and creeping, as their voices became nothing but a dull roar against the pounding in his ears. Widow. Husband recently dead. Fled on foot. Accused of madness. The details snapped together like trap jaws, forming a picture of Clara so sharp it stole his breath. He forced himself to walk past the men, keeping his face blank, though the edges of his vision pulsed with dread. He loaded the supplies into his saddlebag with mechanical precision, trying to steady his breathing. But the words, stole, mad, dangerous, echoed inside him like a rattling fence post in high wind. He had seen no madness in Clara, no wildness except the fear she kept chained behind her ribs. He had seen only a woman exhausted, grieving, hunted by shadows she refused to name. If she had stolen anything, he thought grimly as he swung into the saddle, it was her own freedom. But lies had a way of traveling faster than truth in a land as wide and unforgiving as the West, and men with money, men like Holt, could make their version of a story stick like tar. Eli rode out of town at a pace just shy of reckless, the winter wind biting his face as he pushed his horse harder, every hoofbeat pounding the same refrain into the earth. Claire had not found him by accident. Someone was looking for her, and that someone was close enough to smell blood on the air. By the time Eli crested the final ridge and saw the faint wisp of smoke rising from the cabin's chimney, dusk had already swallowed half the sky, bruising the horizon purple. and his stomach twisted with guilt for returning so late. Guilt sharpened further when he spotted Claire on the porch, clutching the baby tight against her chest, her figure rigid as a fence post braced against a storm. The moment she recognized him, her shoulders sagged, but the relief lasted only a heartbeat before something like terror surged through her expression. She hurried down the steps, barefoot in the snow, eyes darting behind him as if expecting riders to appear from the dark. "You were gone too long," she whispered, voice trembling, and though she tried to mask it with a thin smile, Eli saw her hands shaking where they held the child. He dismounted slowly, acutely aware of how the shadows stretched around them, how exposed the little homestead suddenly felt. "I said I'd be back," he replied gently, but the words didn't comfort her. They only made her glance toward the road again, as if expecting the worst to follow minutes behind him. He reached out, barely touching her arm. "Clara, what's wrong?" She stiffened, swallowing hard, and for a moment he thought she might crumble right there on the porch. Instead, she stepped back, gathering herself like someone accustomed to holding danger at bay through sheer force of will. "Did anyone follow you?" she asked, her voice taut as stretched wire. "Did you see anyone? Anyone asking questions?" Her urgency made the hair rise on Eli's arms. He wanted to tell her he'd seen no one, that the ride home had been quiet, except it hadn't been quiet, not in his mind, not after what he'd heard in town. He carried the truth like a hot coal in his pocket as he herded her inside, shutting the door firmly behind them. The baby whimpered from Clara's trembling, and she immediately softened, rocking her with slow, steady motions until the child calmed. Only then did Clara sit, exhaustion dragging at her features, and Eli felt the moment settle heavy between them, a reckoning he knew was coming but didn't know how to start. He knelt near the fire, setting the supplies down, letting the crackling kindling fill the silence until he finally said, soft but steady, "Clara, there's talk in town." The words alone made her flinch. She knew, he could see it in the way her breath caught, in how her eyes went distant like a woman bracing for a blow she'd taken before. "They're looking for a widow," he continued, watching her carefully, "saying she stole from a rancher, saying she ran mad." At that, Clara's entire body went still, unnaturally still, like an animal cornered by hounds. Her eyes lifted to meet his, and in them he saw fury and fear and a deep, aching sorrow that hadn't yet found words. "It's Laz," she said immediately, her voice too sharp, too fast, as if she had said it many times before to people less willing to listen. "All of it." "Lies," he told, "because lies are easier to believe when a man like him tells them." Eli swallowed, trying to untangle the knot forming beneath his ribs. "Clara, who is he?" She shook her head violently, clutching the baby closer, the movement protective and instinctive. Not yet. If I tell you everything, you'll think." She stopped, breath breaking. "You'll think I'm the monster he paints me as." "I haven't seen a monster," Eli said, his voice rougher than he intended. "I've seen a woman who saved my child's life. That's the truth I know." Tears gathered in Clara's eyes, caught between gratitude and shame. "I didn't steal anything," she whispered fiercely. "I didn't go mad. I ran because I had to. Because staying would have meant—" She stopped again, jaw tightening. Eli leaned forward, resting one hand on the table between them, offering steadiness but not pressure. "Clara, I need to know if danger is coming this way." Her reply was a long, shuddering breath. "Yes," she whispered. "Danger always follows him." And though she offered nothing more, Eli felt the truth in her voice like a cold wind through the cracks in the cabin wall, and knew their quiet days were numbered. The knock came just after midday, sharp and authoritative, the kind of knock that didn't belong to neighbors or travelers, but to someone who carried the weight of the law behind his fist. And Eli's blood ran cold as he glanced toward Clara, who froze mid-step with the baby clutched against her chest. Her face strained of color so quickly it was as though the sound itself had stolen the blood from her veins. Eli motioned for her to move, to slip into the small sleeping alcove behind the curtain, and she obeyed without a word, eyes wide and terrified, the baby stirring in confusion as she pressed herself into the shadows. When Eli opened the door, the winter sun silhouetted a tall man in a dusty coat. steel badge glinting on his chest, his horse snorting steam into the cold air. The marshal swung one leg over and dismounted with the slow confidence of a man used to being obeyed. "Afternoon," he said, his voice low and clipped. "Name's Marshal Burke. I'm looking for a woman. Dangerous, they say. Widow. Been running since early December. You've seen anyone passing through?" Eli kept his face steady, though his pulse hammered against his ribs like a fist trying to break free. "Ain't seen anyone but the storm," he replied, stepping forward just enough to block the marshal's view inside the cabin. Burke's eyes narrowed, studying him with the attentiveness of a man who had learned long ago that liars often wear the clothing of ordinary truth. He shifted his weight, glancing past Dale's shoulder toward the faint movement of the curtain where Clara hid. "You sure about that?" the marshal asked, his tone deceptively mild. "Reports say she might be using folks' kindness to get by. Might be carrying a baby. People do strange things when they're cornered." Eli felt the sting of that implication and clamped down on the anger rising in his throat. "My baby," he said, keeping his voice even. "Wife died a week back. It's just me and the little one here. Haven't had company since before the snow hit." The marshal's gaze flicked to the cradle visible behind Eli, where a tiny blanket rose and fell with the baby's breath, and for a moment something like sympathy creased the lines around his mouth. But suspicion returned quickly, settling into his eyes like a hunter scenting tracks in fresh powder. He peered around Eli, trying to see more of the cabin's interior, and Eli stiffened, a silent challenge. "Mind if I step inside?" Burke asked, already shifting as if he might push past without permission. Eli planted his feet, spine braced like a fence post in hard wind. "Storm's cold," he said, "but my child's trying to sleep. You can ask what you need from right here." It was a risk. Refusing a marshal wasn't something most men dared. But Eli saw the flicker of calculation in Burke's eyes, the weighing of whether forcing the issue would yield truth or only resentment. After a long, taut silence, the marshal exhaled, scratching his jaw. "If you see anyone wandering through," he said finally, "you let me know. Man she ran from says she's unstable. Dangerous, even to herself." Eli met his gaze without flinching. "I'll keep an eye out." Burke hesitated, studying him one last time, suspicion and doubt wrestling behind his eyes. Then he tipped his hat, mounted his horse, and rode off down the trail, the rhythmic thud of hoofs fading slowly into the winter hush. Only after the sound vanished completely did Eli close the door and release the breath he'd been holding. Clara emerged from behind the curtain, trembling so violently he thought her knees might give way, and when she whispered, "He's getting closer," Eli felt the truth of it settle between them like the first shadow of a gathering storm. They waited until the baby slept in the cradle and the fire had burned down to patient coals before Clara spoke, as if the dark and the low light could soften the edges of what she was about to lay bare. And when she began, it was with a small, ordinary sentence. "His name is Gilbert Hampton," that carried the weight of 1,000 whispered warnings. Eli knew the name from town gossip now, but hearing it from her lips made it a living thing, something that could move and strike. She told him then, in a voice that broke and steadied like a sea against stone, about life in the big house beyond the river, about silken servants and a man who wore his money like an armor and his cruelty with the same ease. Jonah, her husband, had been soft-spoken and steady, a man who loved her for reasons that were simple and good. And when he died in the mine, the family's interest shifted quickly from sorrow to ownership. Gilbert, Jonah's brother by blood and a baron by appetite, began with small intrusions, unpaid debts called due, letters suggesting she cede the small parcel of land Jonah had bought with pride, offers of help that came with conditions. When she refused, when she folded her stubbornness like a small, stubborn seed and planted it where it belonged, he escalated. He wanted the land not for its worth but for the control it represented, the authority over a widow he could display to other men as proof he could bend fate to his will. She described the slow, corrosive pressure that followed, servants who looked away, neighbors who received a gift and a warning wrapped in the same ribbon, a doctor employed by Hampton who suggested she was fragile, prone to hysteria. The accusations began as rumors, seated at parlors and whispered across fences, small things meant to leave stains that could never quite be washed out. When she would not agree to his terms, When she refused the remarriage he proposed as a civilized theft, Hampton's methods turned colder and more public. Items from the house were whispered to have gone missing: a brooch, a coin chest, things that could be pointed at and said, "Proof." He hired men to patrol roads, to look for a figure in a dark dress, and he paid for notices that painted her as unhinged, a danger to her neighbors and to children. He told officials he feared for his family's safety. When she protested, she said, "No one who mattered believed a woman without a man's name. Accusations from a man with money and standing were easier to lodge than a manless woman's truth." Clara's hands trembled as she recounted the night she left. A late supper interrupted by Hampton's lawyer, a heated talk where he offered her a final choice: sign the papers that made her land his, or be declared incapable and committed to an institution where property could be reassigned without scandal. The housekeeper had tried to help, she said, but fear kept the staff silent until they could no longer stand the sight of cruelty hidden behind velvet. So Clara left in the dark with nothing but the clothes on her back and a shawl Jonah had left her, and when she discovered her newborn son had been stillborn, how the loss hollered her out. Hampton fed the story to the town that she had harmed the child in a fit of madness. She swallowed hard and told Eli how she had buried the baby herself in the woods, singing to him the only lullaby she knew, and how the weight of that secret had made a kind of armor around her ribs. When she finally ended, her voice so small it might have been a draft, she looked at him and said plainly, "I did not steal. I did not kill my child. I ran because I would not be caged, because I would not let his brother take every piece of Jonah from me, even his name." Eli felt the room tilt with the force of it, the cruelty of a man who could buy stories and set them loose, and for the first time the suspicion that had shadowed Clara's presence turned to anger, righteous and hot. He reached across the table without thinking, taking her hand with a firmness that surprised them both, and the gesture said what no words could yet hold, that he believed her, that he would stand between her and the man who had made his life a weapon. Outside, the wind found a way to sift through the eaves, but inside the cabin there was a new alignment, a readiness forming that had less to do with law and more to do with two people who had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. The warning came not from words but from the sharp crack of a rifle splitting the quiet afternoon, a sound so jarring and wrong that Eli dropped the fence post he'd been lifting and sprinted toward the cabin with a fear that hollered him out mid-stride. He'd left Clara and the baby only minutes earlier to mend the south fence, trusting the stillness of the valley, trusting that danger needed time to travel. But as he crested the rise and saw two horses tethered near the porch, strangers' horses, his heart clenched like a fist. One man stood on the steps, leaning forward with the lazy menace of someone accustomed to taking what didn't belong to him. The other lingered by the horses, hand resting on the butt of his revolver, eyes scanning the tree line with a hunter's patience. Clara stood in the doorway, pale but unyielding, the rifle braced hard against her shoulder despite the tremor in her arms, the baby wailing somewhere behind her. "Back off," she had shouted seconds before Eli came into view, and he saw now the splintered wood where her warning shot had struck the porch rail, close enough to brush hair from the intruder's cheek, far enough to prove she meant business. The man on the steps lifted his hands in a mockery of surrender, a smirk curling the corner of his mouth. "Easy, miss," he drawled. "We just want a word. Heard there's a woman traveling alone out this way. Fits your description, if you don't mind me saying." Clara's voice shook but didn't break. "I said step back." Eli didn't give the man time for another smirk. He barreled toward the cabin at full speed, fury and terror boiling together, shouting Clara's name as he closed the distance. The man whirled at the sound, reaching for his gun, but Eli was faster. He leveled the shotgun he'd snatched from the tool shed, the barrels gleaming cold in the slanting afternoon light. "Drop it," he barked, breath ragged. "Now." The second man by the horses stiffened, weighing whether the coin promised by Gilbert Hampton was worth dying for, but Eli's expression left little room for negotiation. The one closest to the porch hesitated, fingers brushing the handle of his revolver, and Clara shifted her aim a hair's breadth higher, her jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might crack. He said, "Drop it," she repeated, her voice sharper than any blade. Slowly, too slowly for Eli's liking, the man let the revolver fall into the dirt, but his eyes stayed hungry, mean, assessing every escape and advantage. "We ain't looking for trouble," he lied. "Just looking for a woman who don't know what's good for her. Men's worried sick about her back home." "That man doesn't know the meaning of worry," Clara snapped. But Eli reached back with his free hand, a quiet signal to keep her behind him. He held both men in his sights, pulse thumping in his temple. "Mount up," he ordered, "and ride the way you came. If I see either of you near my property again, I'll bury you before the ground freezes." The one by the horses spat in the dirt but swung into the saddle, grumbling under his breath. The other followed, retrieving his revolver only when Eli nodded permission with the threat still burning in his eyes. Before turning his horse, the armed man cast a last look at Clara, a look filled with promise and malice. "He ain't given up," he warned. "We'll be back, and next time, we won't be polite." They rode off in a whirl of hoofbeats, snow and dust kicking behind them like smoke from a fuse. Only when the riders vanished over the ridge did Eli lower the shotgun, his hands trembling with a delayed violence. Clara sagged against the doorframe, breath shuddering from her lungs, and Eli reached her in 3 strides, pulling her close, feeling her fear echo his own. "They found us," she whispered, voice thin as thread. Eli nodded, jaw set like stone. "Then we don't wait for them to come again," he said. "Next time, they won't be asking questions." And in the fading light, with danger settling over the valley like an incoming storm, both understood the truth. Their time at the cabin had ended the moment those horses appeared on the horizon. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like, and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. All right then, let's get back on the trail. Night fell heavy and unsettled, the kind of night where the wind seemed to carry whispers, where every creak of the cabin felt like a footstep too close to the door, and Eli paced the worn floorboards with the weight dragging at his chest as he replayed the confrontation again and again. The hired gun smirks, the threat in their eyes, the promise that they'd return with more men, more guns, more certainty. It didn't take a strategist to understand what that meant. Hampton had found their trail. Staying would mean death for him, for Clara, and for the tiny infant now asleep in the makeshift cradle Clara kept close to her bedside. The cabin had been his world, the place he'd built with Sarah, plank by plank, memory by memory. Every beam carried her laughter, every scratch on the table held a story. To leave it felt like tearing loose a piece of himself, but as he watched Clara rock the baby, her arms trembling from the earlier adrenaline, her eyes hollowed with fear, it became painfully clear that the only thing more dangerous than running was staying still. "We can't stay," he said finally, voice low but unshakable, and Clara stiffened, turning toward him with a despair that bordered on panic. "Eli, no, please. You can take the baby and go. She deserves a life. You can still save her. But if you bring me with you, they'll track us faster. They'll hunt you because of me." He closed the distance between them in 3 strides, lifting her chin gently but firmly, forcing her tear-bright eyes to meet his. "Clara, listen to me. I'm not leaving you behind. I won't do it." She shook her head, the movement small but desperate. "You don't understand. If Hampton wants me badly enough to send men here, he won't stop. You'll lose everything, your land, your life, your daughter. You don't owe me anything." "The hell I don't," he said, more sharply than he intended, but the truth in his voice softened her expression. "You saved my child when I had nothing left but grief and a promise I was failing. You stepped through the door and gave her life when she was slipping away in my arms. That ain't something a man forgets, and it damn sure ain't something he abandons." Clara's breath stuttered, and she looked away, biting her lip until it whitened. "I don't want to ruin what's left of your life," she whispered. "You won't," he replied. "But staying? That'll ruin all of ours." She folded into herself for a moment, trembling as the truth settled into her bones, and when she finally looked up again, it was with resignation rather than hope. "Where would we even go?" Eli didn't hesitate. "South. Arizona Territory. My brother's ranch. He'll help us. No one there knows Hampton, and the land's rough, good for disappearing." Clara's eyes widened with disbelief. "Eli, that's weeks of travel. With a newborn. With your shoulder still healing. We won't make it." "We'll make it because we have to," he said. "And if we stay, we won't last another sunrise." The fire crackled softly, throwing shadows that danced across Clara's face, highlighting the war between fear and reluctant understanding. At last, she nodded, slowly, painfully, cradling the baby closer to her chest. Eli wasted no time gathering what little they could carry: dried meat, blankets, spare clothes, the revolver and rifle, the last of the coffee, a small pouch of coins. Everything else, the furniture, the tools, the memories carved into wood, he forced himself to leave. When he stepped outside for a final look, the cold air bit his skin, and the cabin stood silent and still in the moonlight, a monument to a life that had ended the day Claire knocked on his door. Claire came to stand beside him, the baby bundled in her arms, whispering a quiet apology to the night as though it were listening. Eli turned to her, resting a steady hand on her back. "You didn't bring this trouble here," he murmured, "but you're sure as hell not facing it alone." And with that, they stepped off the porch, three souls bound by danger, grief, and a fragile, growing promise, and walked toward the horses waiting in the dark. The road ahead uncertain, but the decision unshakable. They would flee, they would fight, and they would do it together. They left long before sunrise, before even the first pale bruise of dawn touched the horizon, slipping into the cold darkness with only the crunch of frost beneath the horses' hooves to mark their passing. Eli leading the way through the narrow creek beds and rocky cuts he knew from years of riding the land, choosing paths that twisted and doubled back to confuse any trackers sent in Hampton's name. The air bit at their skin, but the movement kept their blood warm, and Clara rode with the baby wrapped tightly against her chest beneath Eli's old wool coat, the child's quiet breathing a small, fragile reassurance amid the vast, indifferent wilderness stretching around them. As they descended into the first canyon, walls rising like shadowed monoliths on either side, Clara occasionally reached down to steady herself, still unfamiliar with long hours in the saddle but determined not to be a burden. And Eli found himself glancing back more than he needed to, checking that she was upright, that the baby slept peacefully, that the terror in her eyes had not tipped into despair. The deeper they traveled, the more distant the homestead became, until it was nothing but a memory swallowed by the cold wind, and Eli felt the hollow ache of leaving Sarah behind tug at him with every mile. He had whispered his farewell at the grave the night before, but goodbye still tasted bitter in his mouth, a guilt that clung to him like dust in the seams of a coat. Yet when he looked at Clara, jaw tight with determination, eyes soft whenever they drifted down to the sleeping newborn, something else stirred inside him, something warmer and more dangerous than guilt, a growing tether, a bond born not of obligation but of shared survival, of nights spent guarding the same fragile life, of grief that echoed between them like a quiet, stubborn heartbeat. They stopped only briefly at midday, hiding beneath a cluster of junipers while the horses drank from a shallow pool, both of them listening for hoofbeats that never came but seemed always just behind the next ridge. Clara fed the baby in the hush of the canyon, her fingers trembling from fatigue and cold, and when Eli offered her his last piece of jerky, she protested weakly before taking it with a small, ashamed nod. They rode on as the sun crept westward, the canyon funneling them into tighter places where echoes made every sound feel close, where Clara's quiet hums to soothe the baby rebounded off the walls and mingled with the steady clop of hooves. As shadows lengthened, the wind began carrying faint, distant noises, perhaps coyotes, perhaps riders, and each time Eli stiffened, scanning the ridges with his rifle laid across his lap. Clara noticed his tension and whispered, "We'll make it," though her voice carried more hope than certainty. He wanted to reassure her, to say he'd die before letting Hampton's men touch her or the child, but the words lodged in his throat along with the memory of Sarah's final breath, and he feared what it meant that he now felt just as fiercely protective of another woman. As twilight bled across the sky, they climbed out of the canyon and into open country, where the land sloped gently southward toward the border, and though the openness made them easier to spot, Eli chose speed over secrecy, pushing the horses into a steady, ground-eating lope. The cold deepened, the stars blinked awake one by one, and still they rode, driven by a single truth. The danger behind them grew closer with every moment they stood still. When they finally stopped for the night beneath an outcrop of boulders, Eli built a small, nearly invisible fire while Clara settled with the baby tucked inside both their coats. As the flames whispered weakly, Eli watched Clara cradle the child, his child, and felt the ache of two loyalties pulling at him, one to the memory of the woman he had loved, and one to the living woman sitting beside him in the dark, breathing softly into the night, a woman who had brought color and hope to a world he thought had ended. And somewhere between those two truths, he understood that the road ahead was not only dangerous, but life-altering in ways he could no longer pretend not to see. By the second afternoon, with the sun hanging low and sharp over the barren stretch of land ahead, they reached the narrow river crossing Eli had been aiming for, a shallow ford bracketed by dense underbrush and cottonwoods, a place he'd used years ago during spring drives because it offered good cover and a clean break in tracks. But the moment the horse's hoof splashed into the icy shallows, his instincts clawed at him with a warning too late to voice. The brush on the far bank rustled, then split apart as three riders burst through in a violent rush of hooves and shouts, guns already drawn. Clara gasped behind him, curling her body over the baby as Eli wheeled his horse sharply to face the danger, his rifle coming up with practiced speed even as water fanned and cold darks around him. The first shot screamed past his ear, ripping bark from a tree trunk behind him, and Eli fired back instinctively, the crack echoing like thunder across the riverbed. The riders didn't slow, they surged forward with furious purpose, Hampton's brand of merciless intent written in their eyes, their coats snapping behind them like dark wings. One veered toward Clara, reaching out as if he meant to snatch her from the saddle, and Eli turned his horse violently, placing himself squarely between her and the attacker, pulling the trigger again. The blast knocked the man's hat clean off and sent him reeling, though not enough to unseat him. Clara screamed his name as another rider came from the bank's opposite flank, firing wildly, and Eli felt the world tilt for a heartbeat as a searing punch slammed into his left shoulder, hot, brutal, tearing muscle from bone. The force nearly ripped him from the saddle, his vision going white at the edges, but he clung on with a desperation forged in grief and love and raw instinct, lowering himself over his horse's neck as he shouted, "Ride, Clara, go." She obeyed, heels driving into her horse's flanks as she bent low over the baby, the infant's terrified cries carried off by the chaos. Eli fired again with his good arm, buying precious seconds as bullets splashed into the river around them like angry hail. Clara reached the opposite bank, her horse scrambling for footing, and Eli pushed his exhausted mount after her, blood dripping hot down his side, fingers numb but refusing to let go of the reins. The riders thundered after them, cursing, firing, the air thick with smoke and fury. The moment they reached the tree line, Eli grabbed Clara's reins, yanking her horse into a sharp turn that plunged them into the thickest, wildest part of the woods, low branches whipping at their faces, underbrush clawing at the horse's legs, the uneven ground threatening to break them before bullets did. Behind them the riders followed for a stretch, their shouts fading in and out as the terrain grew rougher. But soon the forest turned into a maze of fallen logs and rocky outcrops, too tight for pursuit at full speed. A final burst of hooves, then the sounds of riders breaking off, cursing them as cowards fleeing into land that would swallow them long before they reached safety. When the woods finally quieted, Eli slumped forward, dizzy, breath shallow, blood soaking the front of his shirt and dripping onto the saddle horn. Clara slowed her horse immediately, swinging down with frantic hands as Eli struggled to stay upright. She caught him before he fell, her arms straining beneath his weight, tears streaking her dirt-smudged face as she whispered his name over and over. The baby wailed against her chest, sensing the terror choking the air. Their packs, supplies, blankets, food, were gone, lost somewhere in the river or torn loose in the chaos, leaving them with nothing but two exhausted horses, a rifle low on ammunition, and a bleeding man whose strength flickered like a candle in the wind. Clara pressed her hand hard against his wound, trembling as she tried to steady her breathing. "We have to move," she whispered, voice breaking. Del circled back. "We can't stay here. Eli, please, stay with me." And as he forced his eyes open, fighting the pull of darkness, Eli understood with stark, brutal clarity, the true hunt had begun, and their survival now depended on a woman who had already lost everything except the will to run. Clara half-dragged, half-supported Eli through the twisting maze of boulders and scrub, following nothing but instinct and a desperate hope that somewhere in the labyrinth of stone the land might offer mercy. When she finally spotted the collapsed remains of an abandoned mining cabin tucked into the canyon wall, its roof half-caved, its door hanging crooked, relief buckled her knees, but she forced herself to stay upright, murmuring reassurances to Eli even as his weight sagged heavier against her with every step. Inside, the place smelled of dust and old wood, but it had 4 walls and a fireplace, and that was more shelter than they'd had since the river ambush. She eased him onto the remnants of a cot, her hands trembling as she tore open his blood-soaked shirt and saw the angry wound beneath, a deep, brittle gouge through the shoulder where the bullet had passed, edges torn and swelling with the beginning signs of infection. Panic fluttered in her throat, but she swallowed it hard. Her mother had taught her the old mountain ways of tending wounds when Claire was barely tall enough to stand at the table. "You stay with me," she whispered fiercely to Eli, and then she set to work with a ferocity born of terror and love, ripping strips from her petticoat for bandages, heating water from the canteen over a fire sparked from flint, and cleaning the wound with the last of the whiskey, biting her lip so hard she tasted blood each time Eli cried out in delirious pain. The fever came quickly. By nightfall his skin burned like fire and his breath rasped as if each inhale had to be clawed from deep inside his chest. Clara stayed beside him without rest, bathing his forehead, forcing sips of water between his cracked lips, whispering whatever words she could find to anchor him to the world. During those fevered days and nights, Eli wandered through memories he had buried beneath years of grit and silence, and the truths he had never dared speak spilled out in raw, broken fragments. He murmured his wife's name first, Sarah, voice thick with grief that time had never softened. Clara held her breath as he confessed that Sarah's death was not the peaceful passing he told the world, but a quiet slipping away fueled by despair after the baby was born, that he had found her with the laudanum bottle empty, that he had lied to everyone out of shame and love, carrying the guilt like a branding iron pressed against his heart. His voice broke as he whispered apologies into the darkness, saying he should have seen her pain, should have reached her in time, should have saved her. Clara brushed his hair back gently, aching for a man who carried burdens too heavy for one soul. Then came the words that made her still completely, her hand frozen above his skin. He murmured that he feared failing again, failing his daughter, failing Clara, failing the fragile flicker of hope he had found the night she stepped through his door with milk and trembling hands. And then, softer still, barely audible beneath the fever's ragged breath, he said he loved her, said it like a confession torn from a place he hadn't met anyone to see, said it with a raw honesty that made Clara close her eyes and press her forehead to his uninjured shoulder just to steady herself. She didn't know if the words belonged to the fever or to the man beneath it, but they settled inside her with a warmth she had no right to feel in a world so full of danger. For 3 days she fought the fever that tried to claim him, her body aching, her eyes raw from exhaustion, the baby tucked against her chest as she worked and prayed and refused to let him go. On the 4th morning, Eli's fever finally broke, leaving him drenched in sweat but breathing evenly, his eyelids fluttering before opening to find Clara's face above him, streaked with soot and worry. She exhaled a breath she'd been holding for days, touching his cheek with trembling fingers. "You came back," she whispered. Eli swallowed, pain flickering in his eyes but awareness returning with it. "Didn't plan on going anywhere," he rasped, and though she said nothing about the words he'd spoken in delirium, her eyes held him, as if she could see the pieces of his heart he had unknowingly laid bare. They had barely traveled 2 days beyond the abandoned cabin when the land funneled them into a narrow mountain pass, a jagged cut in the stone where the path thinned barely the width of a single rider, cliffs rising like walls on either side. Eli felt dread coil in his gut the moment the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint echo of hoofbeats closing in from behind. Clara sensed it too. Her grip tightened on the reins, her other arm wrapped protectively around the baby, who whimpered against her chest. They urged the horses forward, but the pass choked into a steep bottleneck, impossible to cross at speed, and before they were halfway through, riders appeared at the far end, 5 of them, dark silhouettes against the pale morning sky, blocking all escape. Eli cursed under his breath, wheeling his horse around just in time to see more riders closing in from behind. their shouts rolling off the canyon walls like thunder. They were trapped, penned in by stone and men who had hunted them across miles of wilderness. He saw Hampton himself riding at the center of the formation, dressed in a fine coat despite the rugged terrain, his expression an ugly knot of triumph, greed, and something colder than hatred. "There she is," Hampton bellowed, pointing at Clara like she was nothing more than a stray animal to be retrieved. "Take her alive. The child too. The man is expendable." Clara sucked in a sharp breath, her fingers trembling where they clutched the baby, and Eli felt something hot and furious ignite in him. Not fear, but a fierce, unyielding resolve. He turned to her, his voice low but steady. "When I give the word, ride. Don't look back. Don't stop. Get the baby to safety." "No," Clara whispered, shaking her head violently, eyes already shining with terror. "Eli, I won't leave you." "I won't? You will," he said, and though his voice cracked, his determination did not. "You have to. I won't lose you both. Not today." Before she could argue, he dismounted, stumbling slightly on his still healing leg, and placed himself between her and the advancing riders, raising his rifle though he knew it held only 2 bullets. Still, he stood tall, taller than he felt, ready to buy her time with whatever life he had left. Hampton laughed, an oily, grating sound. "How noble," he sneered. "A widower playing hero for a madwoman. Drop the gun, boy. You're finished." Eli's reply was drowned out by a sudden, cracking gunshot that came from neither side of the pass. Then another, and another. Riders shouted in confusion as a lone horseman toured into view from the ridge above, his coat flapping behind him, badge glinting sharply in the sun. Marshal Burke. But he was not alone. Behind him rode a woman Eli did not recognize at first. Older, stern-faced, hardened by loss, Van Clare gasped, hand flying to her mouth. "Mrs. Coyle," she whispered, the Hampshire housekeeper who had once shown her kindness. The marshal's voice thundered across the rocks. "Hold your fire. By order of the law." Chaos erupted as Burke fired a warning shot, forcing Hampton's men to pull back. "Gilbert Hampton," the marshal roared, "you are under arrest for conspiracy, coercion, filing false accusations, and attempted murder. Multiple witnesses have testified against you, your housekeeper included." Hampton's face twisted, shock curdling into rage. "Lies. All lies. That woman is unstable, dangerous. She, enough," the marshal snapped, leveling his gun. "We know the truth. Your reign of fear is finished." In a fit of desperation, Hampton reached for his revolver, but Eli fired first, the shot tearing the weapon from his hand and sending him sprawling. Hampton screamed, clutching his wrist, and his men, seeing their employer fallen and the badge of federal authority gleaming above them, slowly lowered their weapons. Within minutes, ropes were binding Hampton's hands, the marshal reading his charges while Mrs. Coyle approached Claire with tears in her eyes, apologizing for not speaking sooner, for being too afraid until now. Clara wept as the woman embraced her, the baby stirring softly between them, sensing the shift in the air, the danger finally thinning. When the marshal dismounted and approached Eli, he placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "You saved her," he said quietly. "You saved them both." Eli didn't answer. He only turned to Clara, who was already reaching for him, eyes full of relief and something deeper, something that made his heart stumble in his chest. And when she stepped into his arms with the baby nestled between them, he felt the world finally settle, like dust after a long storm. Hampton was escorted away, cursing and bleeding, his lies unraveling with every step, while the canyon slowly returned to silence. In that silence, Clara looked up at Eli with a trembling smile. "It's over," she whispered. "We're free." Eli exhaled a long, shuddering breath, pressing his forehead to hers. "Then let's start living," he murmured. Exhausted but alive, hunted no longer, the three of them rode south together, toward Arizona, toward his brother's ranch, toward a new beginning no longer shadowed by fear but shaped by love, survival, and the fierce promise of a life they would build side by side. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again. Hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, Every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.